So if you're asking me, am I worried that growing public indebtedness is going to ultimately force central bankers' hands to run the printing presses yet again? Yes, I actually am a little bit worried about that. I don't think that we can forestall that. I would certainly like to avoid it by gaining control over spending growth. But if history is any indication, that's very, very hard to do.
Hello, welcome again to another episode in the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on another guest who has been on before. It's been a couple of years now, but he's been on and we've talked a lot about the Federal Reserve, even school choice and some other things. But now with so much more going on in the news, a new presidency, the Federal Reserve making some changes, I thought, you know what? I want to have my good friend, Dr. Alex Salter, back on. So, Alex, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show again.
Good to be back, Vance. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. You're always doing such great work. I can't keep up with all the op-eds and everything that you're doing, but it's always good to have you on and talk. And before we get going, though, let me go ahead and give a quick bio for the audience if they may have missed the last couple. Hopefully they didn't. If not, they need to go to the show notes and watch those. But let me give a short bio, and then we'll jump right into it. So Dr. Alex Salter is the Georgie G. Snyder Associate Professor of Economics in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University, Reckham, the Comparative Economics Research Fellow at TTU's Free Market Institute, and an Associate Director of the Journal of Private Enterprise. Additionally, he is a Sound Money Project Senior Fellow and a Young Voices State Beat Fellow. He has tons of books. Money and the Rule of Law was the one that we talked about previously, but it also has another one, The Spirit of 76, Libertarianism and the American Renewal, The Political Economy of Distributism. I mean, just tons of great stuff. So I'll put all this in the show notes page. And usually, as you know, Alex, like I'll usually say what's been up, what motivates you to do what you do every day. But instead of going through that again, let's just update it now. What's been motivating you these days to do what you do?
Oh, man. Economic policy is at a crossroads right now, isn't it?
Yeah.
We just had a national election for control of the government, not just the presidency, but also the legislature. And this really was, I think, a referendum on competing economic visions for the country. And so there's so much that's on the table in terms of economic policy reform. We can talk about fiscal policy. We can talk about monetary policy. We can talk about regulation, tariffs, capital taxation, all this stuff. There are so many moving parts and there's so much prospect for change now. I think that as economists, we really have a responsibility to bring our training to bear on these questions to help improve public deliberation so we can figure out which way we want to go.
Yeah, amen. I think that's exactly right. And it reminds me of Thomas Sowell, right? There are no solutions, only trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're always trying to do is figure out what are these trade-offs. And you're a pro at that, Alex, on so many levels. And it's always great to see your writings and continue that, what kind of what God's calling is for you and keeping you to continue to do that, Alex. It's always great work. I'm kind of a little bit of a loss of where to start, just given how much is going on. But given that the presidential election just happened, let's start there, right?
Seems a reasonable place to begin.
I know, exactly. But so we have a new administration coming in. Maybe first, though, what would you give the grade, or how would you characterize the last 3+ years under the Biden administration? Maybe start there, and then we can kind of get into the Trump administration and maybe the prospects for it.
On the whole, pretty bad. And I would say very bad, culminating in mediocre. You had a lot of pundits looking at the economy on the eve of the election, thinking that the economy was not going to be an issue that broke Republican because inflation's coming back down and unemployment looks pretty good. Growth seems reasonably strong. What they missed, though, is that the public is still hopping mad about the higher permanent cost of living that we had because of the combination of excessively loose fiscal and monetary policies following COVID. People are really angry about how much milk costs, how much eggs cost, how much it costs to pay their bills, real estate prices, housing prices. These things are up, 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 and it doesn't look like they're going to go back down. If you look at the exit polls, it's pretty clear that the number one issue in this election was the cost of living. And I think voters treated this first and foremost as a referendum of those two economic models that we were discussing before. They decided they didn't like what they had over the previous 4 years. and they wanted to return to the kinds of economic policies that they had from 2016 to 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. Well put there, Alex. And I think when you dig into some of the things that were going on, I mean, I would suggest that in 2020, there were some bad policies that were going on with the CARES Act and the COVID lockdowns. And then there was December of 2020, there was a big bill right before Trump left office that added more and checks out to people and plus up on unemployment benefits and everything else that just really spiked the national debt, I think, by another $5 trillion over that period. But
of course, favorite part, Vance, of that December bill was the fact that it was released to the House of Representatives 8 hours before the vote. Yep. Can you imagine reading a 1,000-page bill that spends all that money in 8 hours?
No.
There's no way you can. Even if you have a team of people, you simply cannot have an intelligent opinion about the contents of that piece of proposed legislation. But leadership and the lobbyists closed the door. They came out with this monstrosity. They went to the body of the House of Representatives. The Senate already knew what was going to be in it. And the House said, look, up or down, if you want to keep your job, you do what we say.
Yeah.
That's not particularly conducive to the spirit of Republican self-government. And so I'm kind of offended that we did business that way, even independently from the contents of the bill. I have major procedural issues with that way of doing public business.
Yeah. This is a great point, Alex. The procedures, that's what's going on in Congress, are all broken. I mean, just they can't pass a bill or a budget. They keep doing CR after CR. And I know that there was the changes that were made, I believe it was in 1974, whenever they made these changes to the budget, put it up into 12 different bills through all these committees. And then I think the hope was that they would each come up with the best case scenario for each one of those bills and then put it all together to a budget and pass it. But the problem is that just doesn't work in Congress. I mean, even in Texas, where we both live, they pass one budget and then it's done. And so I think you're right on about these procedural things need to change. I don't know if it's just to go to one budget or whatever, but those are major issues that are keeping us from being as fiscally responsible as what they should be, right?
Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse. They've not been using it particularly responsibly. I understand that we're in an era of heightened partisanship and it's very hard to secure the agreement. So you just go with CRs because that's what can get the buy-in. You postpone the really big political fights. That's not going to fly forever. I'm convinced that the American people are increasingly sick of this way of conducting public business. They want the government to work the way that it's supposed to work. They want our public officials to follow the user's manual, to follow the Constitution of the United States. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to get something like a return to regular order, proper decision-making in the next couple of years. I don't think that necessarily means that we're going to see spending restraint.
Yeah.
Again, we can separate the procedures of the bills from the content of the bills. In fact, I'm quite confident there's not going to be a whole lot of spending restraint for the foreseeable future, alas. But if we could figure out a way to get the legislature to actually do its job, I think that would go a long way to satisfying American citizens' concerns with the way our government makes decisions.
Yeah, right on. One of the things that's kind of interesting, and just to finish my thought earlier, is that you had this massive increase under Biden, under the ARPA plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. There's an Investment in Jobs Act. I mean, go through all of these different ones, but during that period, there's been about $8 trillion more added to the national debt over that period. So to your point, it doesn't look like we're in a position to slow down spending at any time, because a lot of this would, quote unquote, on autopilot when you think about mandatory programs like Social Security and Medicare, which it seems like Trump has said again, look, these are off the table, which is kind of unfortunate, but that's the political reality of what we're living with right now. But given what you said, though, about during the Biden administration, the cost of living increases and what the Federal Reserve did during that time. And I hope that there's some key lessons for us to learn from so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And one of the things that I've been a little bit concerned about here lately, Alex, is will we repeat the mistakes of the 70s when we had kind of the boom and bust cycles, if you will, from the Federal Reserve and increasing the money supply too much, and then they raised interest rates thinking that they were kind of done with it, and they cut the money supply, and then we had these boom and bust cycles not only in the economy but inflation as well, until arguably Volcker came in, slayed the beast with jacking up interest rates extraordinarily high and cutting the money supply, and then we had this period of what's considered to be the Great Moderation. Now, I don't know that we're going to be in that situation. In the CPI inflation actually released today when we're recording this, the headline number was up to 3.3, or the core was up 3.3%.
Yeah, core was 3.3, headline was 2.6.
Exactly. And so the headline went up a little bit. Core has been going up over the last couple of months. So I'm a little concerned about where we're going to be heading in the future. However, given your insights and the case for monetary rules, which we both want, what's been kind of your latest analysis of what you would give for what the Fed's done along with what fiscal policy has been doing?
Great question. So I think that the broad disinflationary trends that we've observed over the past couple of months are welcome. I credit the Fed with actually recognizing the problem and then finally fixing it. But again, not too much credit since they lit that fire in the first place. Here's why I'm not that concerned about the fact that consumer prices are still running above 2% year over year growth. If you actually look under the hood of that CPI data release, what you see is that most of the price increases are coming from shelter prices. And shelter prices are traditionally and historically have been lagging indicators of inflationary pressures in the economy. So shelter rose 0.4% last month. It's risen just shy of 5% over the past 12 months. That by itself is responsible for, it's weighted 1/3 in the overall CPI basket, and it's weighted 1/2. It's half of the core CPI basket. So of course, when shelter prices go up, that's going to pull up the overall average. And so what I think that we're actually observing here isn't inflation as we traditionally conceive it, right? Inflation means all prices, or at least most prices, are going up. I think recently the CPI and PCEPI have been picking up a relative price change, a price change for a specific good or service, in this case, shelter. And so it's making it look like inflation is still elevated. But if you look at the other areas aside from shelter, those are more or less where they want them. And hopefully we can get shelter price increases normalizing soon as that previous inflationary pressure that had been built up gets unleashed. And then we see something more like a return to trend growth. So I think that over the past 6 months or so, Federal Reserve monetary policy has been broadly appropriate. I don't think that that's an endorsement of the way that they conduct their business. I still think that we need rules rather than discretion in monetary policy. But given that we have discretion now, I'd rather it be used well than poorly. They've done a passable job in the past half year or so. Yeah, and we've seen the monetary base, go down. Their assets have been about $7 trillion now compared to the $9 trillion it was before. The Fed just cut interest rates, was it last week, down to 4.5% to 4.75%. So that's down 75 basis points. In that range compared to where we were a couple months ago. And so we're seeing some changes that are happening there, which will be interesting to see how what direction they continue to go. They'll have one more meeting in December, right? And then we'll see what happens. That's also a meeting where we get the next summary of economic projections, their forecast, basically.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, with the new Trump administration coming in and hopefully with more pro-growth policies, that'll be interesting to see how they take into account some of those factors as well. One thing, though, I did want to hit on real quick was about the housing and the shelter issue. I know, like in the Austin area, we've seen prices decline by about 10%. The median value has declined 10% over the last year. Some other places that's happened across the state. But it's interesting because when I talk to some folks in the housing community and industry, they don't really see that prices are going to go down that much. Like they're still seeing some increases across the country. And some of that's due, I think, to the lock-in effect, where you have these higher interest rates now. Do you really want to leave your home? Plus, you got to go pay a lot more to get the same size home and a higher interest rate. So it just makes it much more costly for people to leave their home. And that reduces the supply, or at least the turnover that we have in the housing market. I wonder if maybe some of that could be a little bit longer lasting in the shelter portion of the CPI than maybe what we anticipate. I don't, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think that shelter prices are going to come down on average very much. Of course, as you noted, there's massive regional and sectoral differences just in terms of geographic location for these things. You probably can't analyze what's going on in Dallas and say that it's the same as what's going on in Baltimore, for example. You wouldn't want to go that far. That being said, I think that what we can and look forward to and can probably expect is a moderation in the rate of price increases. And as that happens, as price growth slows down, that's when we should see that really big component of the CPI not dragging up the overall, pulling up, I should say, the overall average quite so much. I think that that's probably the best that we can hope for.
Yeah.
There's things in the background we can talk about. If the Federal Reserve decides to change on a dime and tighten again, well, we know that the price of credit is an input to the price of mortgages, and so that could have an effect on the demand for the credit instruments that we use to buy houses. Right. Yeah. We can talk about supply and demand dynamics in those particular markets, but I still think that the most likely outcome is in the next couple of months, we're going to start seeing shelter price growth moderate, and that's going to result in headline inflation coming from 2.4, 2.6 down closer to the 2% annualized figure that the Federal Reserve is in principle targeting.
Yeah, makes sense. One of the things that I've been also looking at with the Fed, and I always respect your views on the Fed, Alex. I learned a lot from your writings over the years, and in talking with you, is they're kind of in a little bit of a bind though too. I don't know how much of a role this plays for Jay Powell and others, but just given the national debt and the net interest payments on the debt, right, going over $1 trillion. I guess it's the second most spending item now compared to Social Security. I think is number one, and then net interest on the debt. Then you have Medicare and some other things, and even more than defense, right? It's $860 billion a year, I think. But that also is going to put them, I think, in a bind for a while, unless we can get some spending restraint, which I want to get into a little bit next. But do you think how much of a weight do you think that carries on what the Federal Reserve is trying to do, even with their independence and everything else? But they can see how that large amount of debt, running over $100 trillion or over 100% of GDP right now in gross public debt or gross debt, how that's weighing on the overall economy. And so it's got to be in the back of the mind to some extent, don't you think?
They like to insist on their independence, the Federal Reserve does, but I remember it wasn't that long ago when they basically propped up the market for government debt in the during and after the COVID crisis. So for all Jay Powell's proclamations that they don't pay attention to fiscal policy, spoiler alert, they pay attention to fiscal policy. Yeah. So I think that we need to separate the economic effects here to make sure that we have a good mental model of what's going on. Fiscal deficits by themselves, I do not think are inflationary. Yeah. I don't think that we have very good reason to suppose that. That's old school Keynesianism. We have basically a lot of accumulated evidence that that's wrong. The two episodes that I like to point to are Reagan's first administration, where he started running really big deficits as a percent of GDP. But inflation came down precisely because Volcker was doing his thing. That's what happened then. And then, of course, at the end of the second Bush and the beginning of Obama's first administration, big increases in public debt to fight the fallout from the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Again, inflation was low and stayed low despite the massive increase in the deficit because monetary policy ultimately drives inflation. Mm-hmm. There are, however, interaction effects between fiscal and monetary policy. Specifically, what you pointed to before is, I think, very important. When the public sector becomes increasingly indebted, that can put pressure on central bankers to run the printing presses to lower the interest rates on government securities, to basically lower government borrowing costs. And you can do that in the short run, particularly if you surprise markets, if you do more money printing and more interest rate lowering than they anticipate. The cost of that, though, is that all that new liquidity is eventually going to circulate throughout the economy and drive up prices. So the inevitable consequence of all this is inflation. And I think that this is ultimately what's behind a lot of concerns that the U.S. fiscal position is just not sustainable. Push come to shove, I really don't think it's likely that the politicians are going to ever allow a default on the government debt. We're not going to miss an interest payment. We're not going to fail to pay back what we've paid. Yeah. And frankly, the consequences for global financial markets, if that were to be the case, would be pretty severe. And so I'm not one saying that we should repudiate the debt. But if we're not gonna raise taxes to pay for it, because taxes are politically unpopular, and we're not going to cut spending because that's politically unpopular, what's the only arrow left in the quiver? The only thing that you can do is print money.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that you can assume this continued independence of fiscal and monetary policy. These are political decisions. Fiscal policy is political. Everyone sort of understands that. Monetary policy is political. Very few people understand that. As long as it's public sector decision making, there are going to be political pressures from fiscal to monetary and from monetary to fiscal. In some ways, I think it makes sense to actually evaluate these things as one single institution with multiple facets rather than just separate processes that don't have anything to do with each other. So if you're asking me, am I worried that growing public indebtedness is going to ultimately force central bankers' hands to run the printing presses yet again? Yes, I actually am a little bit worried about that. I don't think that we can forestall that. I would certainly like to avoid it by getting control over spending growth. But if history is any indication, that's very, very hard to do.
Yeah, it's been a bipartisan problem for decades. It's unfortunate, this overspending that's been going on.
Everyone likes spending other people's money.
Yeah, they do. They do. And, you know, and you and I talked about this. I mean, we're in this kind of populist era now where it's easier to give handouts from tax cuts and spending increases than it is to say, I'm going to take away the spending and raise your taxes.
Yeah, the populism
makes it tough.
Definitely a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
On the one hand, the populist resurgence, populism can be a little bit of a healthy instinct when it's a revolt or reaction to elite corruption and mediocrity. And I think any honest observer of the federal government of the United States has to admit that we've had a lot of elite mediocrity and a lot of elite corruption, and people are understandably furious about that.
Yeah.
So I think that can actually be a salutary aspect of populism. The problem comes in when it becomes the handout culture, as you noted, when it becomes everybody gets a favor, when it becomes we're going to run economic policy, quote, for the common man, but in practice that means policies that look and sound nice, but create all these hidden costs for the economy that ultimately clamp down on and make impossible a pro-growth agenda. And that's ultimately what we need to get. We need to get back to a pro-growth, solid supply side promoting economic agenda that actually allows people to produce new wealth.
Yeah.
That's the ball game. Yep.
I totally agree. All right. So you have this new piece out recently on inflation under Trump. And it's at National Review, and I'll make sure to put this in the show notes page. But Trumping Inflation, you always have good titles for your pieces, but Trumping Inflation. And so as we kind of work through the history and where we've been and some issues that's going on there, tell us a little bit about what you think about inflation under the Trump administration.
So the motivation for that piece was during the campaign, and especially your listeners have probably heard of this letter that was signed by a bunch of prominent economists, many of whom were also Nobel laureates, warning that inflation would actually be worse under a second Trump administration. And they pointed to two main prospective causes of what they said would cause inflation. One is Trump's trade policies, particularly tariffs driving up the prices of goods and services. And the other is Trump's occasional expressed interest in changing how the Fed works, making the Fed more directly accountable to politicians. So I wanted to take those one at a time in this piece. First of all, while I acknowledge that a tariff agenda, if it's enacted, would make specific goods and services more expensive, that's not really what we mean as economists when we talk about inflation. We mean sustained dollar depreciation. Right, of the kind that we've had for basically 60 plus years now, where the dollar loses between 2 to 4% of its purchasing power every year on average. That's a very different thing than targeted public policies that are going to make the price of steel or rubber more expensive. Now, I think that that's going to drive up business costs. If you slap a tariff on imported steel, imported rubber, all the U.S. manufacturing firms that use those goods as inputs to their own production process are going to see their costs go up. And so they're going to try and pass that on to consumers. Consumers are going to respond by buying less. This is another case of the tax burden being split between buyers and sellers, depending on how sensitive buyers and sellers are to those price increases. Of course, prices are going to go up, but that's a relative price effect. That's a microeconomic effect. Trade policy is about microeconomics. It's about relative prices. And inflation is a macroeconomic phenomenon. And I think that we still have to keep our eye on central bankers if we really want to understand inflation. So that gets us to the Fed. Trump has said that he wants more political control over, for example, the Fed's interest rate decisions, we do have a classic model in economics, right? The political business cycle model that predicts if you give people on short-term election cycles control over monetary policy, they're going to run the printing presses right before the election. That's going to make the economy look stronger than it is. They get reelected. The hangover eventually comes, but only after they're safely ensconced in office, right? They've been elected. They're in office. They've taken the oath. They don't have anything to worry about. Okay, I grant that concern. Here's why I don't think that it's the end of the story. One, that seems to say that politicians are really, really good at fine-tuning monetary policy. You have to time this pretty precisely, right? You have to run the printing presses at just the right time before the election to make sure that you get the inflation and all the nasty stuff just after the election. If the central bankers, the quote-unquote experts, can't do that, can't fine-tune monetary policy that well, and it's very clear that they can't. Remember when everyone said inflation would be transitory a few years ago? So it's clear that the experts don't know what they're doing. How are the generalist politicians who don't know a thing about monetary policy going to do any better? I think that that's a little bit of a stretch. Also, I think you have to seriously consider the fact that right now, the people making monetary policy decisions are almost completely insulated from the consequences of their decisions. The only incentive they have not to get it wrong is that they don't want to go down in the history books as someone bad, right? Someone who allowed too much inflation, or on the other side of that, like another Great Depression or whatever. But there's no real accountability. If we had real accountability, central bankers would lose their jobs for creating 9% consumer price inflation. If we actually had politicians making more monetary policy decisions, the voters could kick them out whenever inflation got high. That's at least something like an accountability mechanism. That creates a basic measure of responsibility. And I would rather have some responsibility compared to no responsibility, which is basically what we have now. This is why even Milton Friedman, the godfather of monetarism, in a 1962 essay expressed skepticism about the idea of central bank independence, because he recognized that central bank independence meant that the central bankers could basically be a law unto themselves. They weren't answerable to anybody. And so you would understandably predict that if people are wielding power for which they are not responsible, they're going to do some pretty irresponsible things. Now, I don't think that that means that the president of the United States should be deciding what the Fed funds rate target is. That's not what I'm embracing. There is a medium here. The solution, of course, is, wait for it, I know you're going to be shocked, monetary policy rules. Ooh. I know. Who would have thought that I, who wrote the book on money and the rule of law, would care about monetary policy rules? It's a shocker. Right. Congress and the president should pick a concrete rule for the dollar's purchasing power and force the Fed to hit it.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is it should be possible to remove central bankers who either ignore the rule or try and hit the rule and fail. Yeah. We need more accountability in monetary policy. We don't need politicians running the Fed on a day-to-day basis. We do need politicians as the people who actually are accountable to the public, to voters, to make the decisions about what the goals of monetary policy should be. It's okay to allow the central bankers to run the Fed to achieve those goals. But in terms of the basic target, what we're trying to do, that needs to be a function of democratic deliberation. We have representatives. We elect people to make these decisions for us. That's what they're there for.
Yeah. Yeah, great points there. It's also interesting, too, thinking back to those Nobel Prize economists and others who signed this letter saying Trump was going to be inflation, bad for the economy. And basically they were choosing Kamala Harris over Donald Trump for the presidency. But it's interesting because when you think about this, and you made a great point about the Keynesian spending and how it doesn't really create the inflation and all of those other issues. But what's interesting is that they overlooked the fact that a lot of the fuel to the fire that the Fed had was by the Biden administration, or at least by Congress and their support for what the Biden administration wanted to do by ratcheting up deficits so much over time. And if Trump was able to do some of the things that he wants to do, which I think most of it's pro-growth, not all of it, but you think about deregulation. I mean, just under the Biden administration and the number of final rules that the American Action Forum calculates each month, or even more than that probably, but often, I mean, I think it's close to $1.8 trillion in new final rule costs on the American economy, which is just a hidden tax, massive tax on the economy. Whereas at this point, the same timeline under Trump's first administration, I think it was a $3 billion increase. So it was not trillions of dollars, it was a $3 billion increase, which I think you and I probably want them to see cuts, less final cost overall, but at least it wasn't $1.8 trillion. And so I think if we can unleash the economy from deregulation by extending some of the Trump tax cuts, if not all of them, I would like to see more reforms actually to the tax code of getting rid of a lot of the carve outs and credits and just lower the rates. Maybe have a higher standard deduction, but simplify it to get to a flat income tax ultimately, right? Is where I would like to see. And then do some of these things like the new Department of Government Efficiency, the Doge or Doge, whatever you want to call it.
Doge, yes,
Doge,
that's right.
There you go. With
Elon Musk and Vivek will save us.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so we'll see how some of those things go. But, to me, Alex, a lot of those are opening up the supply side of the economy, which are deflationary, not inflationary. And it's almost like they don't want to give those things any credit at all. I am still concerned about Trump on spending. He wasn't that big on it before. I'm hopeful, though, that maybe Elon and Vivek will push him more in that direction for his bully pulpit to be used. And then, of course, on the protectionist sort of issues on tariffs and things of that nature, I'm pretty concerned about that as well. But I think there's a lot of good pro-growth policies that could be happening over the next few years. But what say you, Alex? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think that overall we should expect, based on what we've heard, more of a pro-growth agenda, certainly more of a pro-growth agenda than we would have gotten under a Harris administration.
Yeah.
Look, at the end of the day, well-being and prosperity comes down to the supply side. You can't consume goods and services unless you first produced goods and services. And so we need to open up our productive capacity, make sure that we can put our labor, capital, natural resources, technology to the best possible use. Right now, as you noted, we have a lot of discretionary regulations by bureaucrats that are just dragging down the economy. They're serving no useful purpose other than giving the bureaucrats a job and something to do. Those need to go. There's no reason that we can't have 4% real economic growth every year and have that be normal. I truly believe that.
Yeah.
It's a matter of making sure that we get the rules of the game properly. All this demand side stuff, fiscal policy, monetary policy, it's important for stabilizing the business cycle. But in the long run, it's kind of a drop in the pan. Yeah. What really matters, the wealth and poverty of nations, right? It all comes down to what Adam Smith was talking about in 1776. It is making your economy more productive by making it easier to produce and distribute the commodities upon which our well-being depends. And so I like the deregulation agenda. I like the idea of Doge. I'm a little concerned about the tariffs, although I would make a national security exception. I think that it's perfectly reasonable to not want an authoritarian rival like China to have a disproportionate presence in your nation's supply chain. And so I'm hopeful. And by the way, this is something that Vivek Ramaswamy has said explicitly in his public talks. He said, look, if we're going to try and marginally disentangle ourselves from China, make ourselves less reliant on China, that doesn't mean that we're going to be reshoring most of that stuff. We're going to be friendshoring it. We're going to be redirecting our import economy away from hostile nations to friendlier nations. And I'm totally cool with that. I think that that's a great idea. The problem isn't imports per se. The problem is that we are reliant on a trading partner whose economy is simply nothing more than an agglomeration of capital for the ambitions of a ravenous communist party. Capital in China exists to serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think they're good faith actors. I don't want to have anything to do with them. I don't want to fight a war with them, God forbid. But at the same time, I recognize that their interests are not our interests. And so I don't want their components, anything that they're offering us, to have a critical part of our, especially our national security relevant supply chain. So if you're talking about tariffs and capital controls on those things, I think it makes sense in the case of China specifically, maybe also Russia as well, although we're not terribly entangled economically with Russia. But that should also mean that the default stance with our allied nations is absolute free trade. Yeah. No tariffs, no capital controls. There should be no tariffs on Japanese goods. There should be no tariffs on English goods. Get those things down to zero. Write some free trade agreements, make sure that our security that we're pursuing with our trade policy is also counterbalanced by our legitimate desire to increase national wealth.
Yeah. Yeah, no, good points there. And Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that as well. I mean, even when I was in the White House, these are points that I would make too, is that I think we should be having freer trade with our allies. And I think that would ultimately put more pressure on China to change. Like, I just never see that tariffs were going to change them internally to bring more free trade or play by the same rules. Because to your point, I mean, they ultimately don't really care about their people. They don't have to get reelected like we do in America. So it makes it, the marginal costs, marginal benefits are going to be different, such that they're going to keep doing what they think is in their national interests, which are tariffs and subsidizing a lot of their industry and those sort of things to put us at a disadvantage in America. And so I was like, look, what we should try to do to pressure them more is, to your point, have more free trade with our allies and do more things internally that's reducing the cost of doing business. That way, we're not internally also putting more giving incentive for businesses to move to China and other places, because oftentimes, we've got a lot of work to do ourselves internally with corporate income tax rates being too high.
Absolutely.
The regulations that are out there. I mean, occupational licensing. I mean, there's so much, the minimum wage. I mean, there's so much stuff that we are hurting ourselves and incentivizing them to go other places. And yes, the national debt is large and China owns some of that, although they've been selling it off and not buying as much in recent years. And so that's not as much of a connection as you had before. But I remember the other thing too that was always big was kind of the hollowing out of the Rust Belt and what sort of effect that was going to have. And I was like, look, those jobs aren't going to necessarily come back in the same places that you would want them. In fact, a lot of the Rust Belt jobs moved to the Sun Belt, to Texas and Tennessee and Florida and places like that, right? And so we already saw some of this start to change. But I do think it's important, though, Alex, is to think about the displacement of some of these people and for us to be able to talk about it and also understand the national security concerns that you're right to bring up about China, because those of us who are more free market oriented and don't want any trade or any tariffs to be put in place, it puts us on our backstep as being defensive and saying, okay, what exactly do you want here? Well, it's easier, I think, sometimes to say, look, we're going to use these tools to go after kind of China and some other places. And so I think this is just really important part of the discussion. I'm hopeful that what Trump's going to try to do is to unleash some of these obstacles in America, so that way we can be more competitive on a global playing field. Is that kind of what you're saying? I'm hopeful as well.
As well. And there are specific areas where we can actually achieve multiple goals simultaneously, right? Policymakers, if they're savvy, can in fact walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah.
Since we brought up Elon, let's talk about one sector where Trump won was unambiguously excellent: outer space policy. Trump's first administration was the best administration for outer space policy easily since either Eisenhower or Kennedy. Hands down. It was fantastic. And I'm hopeful that we get more of that in Trump too. Why is space such an important area? Because that's one place where we can actually have this building up of a sector that provides gainful, dignified employment to people across the income distribution. Go to SpaceX's website right now. They're building Starship, their next generation super heavy launch vehicle, going to go to the moon, hopefully going to go to Mars. Who are they looking to hire? Yeah, they're looking for college-educated engineers, but who are they really looking for right now? They want welders. They want pipe fitters, and they're paying good money for that. They want trade skill people to come and actually assemble these components. And so you're going to need the technical experts. You're going to need military officers and enlisted people working on this. You're going to need skilled tradesmen to actually assemble all this stuff. That's one area where you can actually have across the entire income distribution and education distribution, people coming together to advance the national interests in a way that is conducive to and respects free enterprise. So these things can be done. And there are complementary policies that we can also pursue, right? Let's not forget that before the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, the U.S. had one of the highest corporate tax rates in the OECD. And the U.S. still has one of the most progressive tax codes in the OECD. You constantly hear this refrain about the rich not paying their fair share. Well, the top 1% of income earners paid basically half of all federal income taxes last year. So you tell me what you think their fair share is. Because if it's not half, I don't know what it is. We need to make sure that the tax base is sustainable. And it's not clear to me that we can squeeze more revenue out of ultra high income earners, out of corporations, without killing the incentives for capital accumulation.
Yeah.
And so I think that smart policy can, at the one hand, liberalize at the margin. And by that, I mean liberalize in its classic good sense, make it easier to produce goods and services, make sure that we can get some degree of buy-in for the people who are left behind by economic change through no fault of their own. I can see that that's going to be something that public policy has to address. But we can do these things in a way that's consistent with America's traditional reliance on free enterprise and limited constitutional government. And I bring up outer space simply because I think that that's a salient example for all of those forces coming together to be a really great policy area for promoting the national interest and leading us into something really exciting in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I love it. And you've had a lot of great articles on what's happening in space. I'll make sure to put some of those in the show notes page. And speaking of great articles, one last one that I want to talk about before we go is, can economic efficiency help society be good? Which is published at the Institute.
You are on top of my stuff, Vance. Both of those were published today.
I know.
You are on top of the ball.
And I get your email that you send out. And I read this stuff, man. I promise you.
That.
And so over at Institute for Faith, Work and Economics, which also does a lot of great work. But this might be a good way to close, though, actually. I think this kind of brings it all together, is I also know that you're a faithful man, you're a believer, and you got your family, and you've got so much going on, and you want things to be good. You want society to be good, and I do too. And we get away from some of this because we talk about the common good, which is, I think, is important to talk about, but it comes too often as government doing things for us instead of the market working efficiently. But I loved your cases that you made in the paper in this article. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about it now.
I'm glad you did. So you're right. This is something that is motivated by my Christian faith. I do believe in Jesus Christ, and I do hope that my life is consecrated to him. The motivation for this particular conversation, this specific article, is considering how much should we care about economic efficiency when we as Christians are deliberating over the nature of the good society. And the answer that I came up with, which is somewhat counterintuitive perhaps for an economist, is not very much. Yeah. Economic efficiency as a moral goal, I simply don't think is that important. What does economic efficiency mean? If you crack open the econ textbook, they're going to say something like, we're maximizing the dollar value of society's scarce resources, right? Economic efficiency means that resources are allocated in a way that people have the property rights to those resources that they're most willing to pay for. That sounds technical and abstract. Really, it's simple. It means that people are getting what they want. If they weren't getting what they want, they would go out and buy more of the stuff that they want. And so the resources would flow to people who are willing to pay for it. That's the basic way of thinking about economic efficiency that makes it intelligible to everybody. People are getting what they want. Is it okay for people to get what they want? If you take Christian moral teaching seriously, frequently the answer is no. There are many things that we want, that we are willing to pay for, that we would be willing to buy, sell, trade for, that are bad for us. And so I don't think that we can outsource our moral reasoning to the market. Markets are good things. Stewardship of creation is a good and godly thing. That doesn't mean that we should be viewing the economics profession as policy engineers for tinkering with dollar spending here, maximizing efficiency there, just making sure that people can get what they want. The whole point of sincere and serious ethical reflection is that it's pretty obvious to Christians and to many people who are not Christians as well, right, other faith traditions or no faith tradition, that we sometimes want things that are bad for us. And it is not good for social systems to give those things to us. Maybe that's something that we have to put up with because any other social system would be worse in predictable ways. I'm sympathetic to that argument. But that doesn't mean that we can outsource our moral thinking to the market. The market is a test of what people want and are willing to pay for. It has its place, but it is not a moral arbiter, and it cannot be.
Well put, Alex. And I liked a lot of that was in this article, and this sentence in particular kind of caught me. Frankly, this is your quote now. Frankly, this creates perverse incentives for economists to act as social planners first and social scientists second. Man, that's so true. It's something that I need to remind myself too, as I work with a lot of policymakers and think tanks across the country. Is I'm trying to do a good service of doing my calling. What I believe God's calling is to let people prosper. That's why I do what I do. But also to make sure that we're humble enough to know that we don't have all the answers. And that's one reason why we need to continue to look at the trade-offs and not just the solutions. And yes, I feel strongly, as I know you do, about school choice, that I hope Texas, we didn't get into all that, but I hope Texas passes the most universal school choice policy next year.
Have me back on. We're going to have a whole episode just about that.
That's right. And so there's so many good things that I believe strongly in people, and I believe that God has put us here to be fruitful and multiply and to flourish in this life. And I'm hopeful that we have more opportunities to do so. And while the market's not perfect and that we have here, it does allow us to have many of the things that we need, may not always what we want, but what we need to survive. And it's great to be able to talk to you, Alex. And I appreciate all you're doing, and God bless you and your family.
Thank you for that. And I think that you put it exactly right. The work that you do is valuable. The work that I do, hopefully, is valuable. Economists working in the public square is a good and can be, in fact, a godly thing if we consecrate it to God. That doesn't mean, though, that we have to embrace the whole man of system, moving pieces on a chessboard view of humanity. We have to never allow ourselves to become social engineers who dispose of other human beings as if they are mere means to our ends rather than ends of themselves, right? This is exactly the point that Adam Smith raised all those hundreds of years ago. And I think it's a point that is very commensurate with Christian social teaching. These people that we're talking about when we're deliberating policy are human beings created in the image of God. They have dignity. They have inherent worth. And we cannot simply treat them as interchangeable parts, as some part of an overall plan for making society more regimented, more bureaucratically efficient. That's not what we're here to do. We are here to help people flourish. We are here to help promote humane, sustainable, flourishing, ethically beautiful lives, because each and every one of us is called to that. And that ultimately has to be our own standards for what we're doing here when we deliberate in public as economists.
Yeah. Amen. Well put, Alex, as usual. Thank you again, and I look forward to chatting with you soon.
Thank you, Vance. God bless you.
Thank you so much. And for the audience, I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned a few things along the way. Please go and give us a 5-star rating wherever you get this. Be sure to share it with your friends and families. I'm sure they'll want to learn some more about economics and how to live a better life overall. And it's always a pleasure to talk with Alex and many others that I have on this show. And I'm appreciative of you for joining me each and every day. Remember, you can find out a lot more of my information at vanceginn.com, and all the show notes, including for this episode, are at vanceginn.substack.com. And until next time, let people prosper.